So now we're going to talk about conditionals, and we're going to start with if statements. So you should be relatively familiar with if statements, and so there's not much of a difference between C++, Java, C Sharp, pretty much any other language. A simple statement will be something like this. num1 is equal to 42 if num1 is less than 42, console write line, your number is less than 42. So that's a very simple conditional. It's just checking to see if the number is less than 42. Since our number is equal to 42, this will never actually write out. And we can do a console.write line outside if statement. This will always print because it is outside of your if. So now if we run this, we should only get one line printed out saying outside if statement, which we do right there. If we change this to less than or equal to 42, now we should get, well, it'll say your number is less than or equal to 42. And so we run this, and now we will get both lines printed out. Additionally, you could say, let's go ahead and go back to less than 42 and less than 42. We can also now say else console.write line, your number is greater than or equal to 42. And so now it will go evaluate this. Since num1 is equal to 42, this will evaluate to false, which means this will not run, and instead it will check to see if there is an else. Since there is an else, now it will actually execute that. So we should get your number is greater than or equal to 42, and then we will get the line after that outside if statement. And we do. Your number is greater than or equal to 42, outside if statement. 3, 2, 1. We can also do multiple conditions, just like before. We can say if num1 is equal to 0. So this is the comparison operator. That's a double equal. And so this will evaluate to true if num1 is the same value as 0. So we can change this line here to say your number is 0. And instead of just else, we could say else your number is not 0. And that's true, but what if we want to check to see, okay, is this number positive or is this number negative? So we could say else if, and now we do a new conditional. num1 is less than 0, then your number is negative. Else, so otherwise it is going to be a positive number. Your number is positive. So, checking 42 here, we check to see if it is equal to 0. Well, it's not, so that is not going to trigger. Now we check to see is it less than 0, and well, it's not. That's not going to trigger, and so otherwise it's doing this. Now you'll notice that writer is highlighting this here, and if you hover over it, it says expression is always false. That's because we declared what num1 is. Num1 is not changing before you get to this block, and so this is always going to be false. This is always going to be false, and so it is always going to do this. So I will get your number is positive, an outside if statement. If I change this to a negative and let it and save it, this is now always true. So notice that this is always going to be false. Now this is always true, which means that this is not actually going to execute. We run this, we get your number is negative and outside if statement. So let's go ahead and change this slightly more. Let's go ahead and say instead your number. We'll just, since I'm using the string interpolation, num1. And let's go ahead and change this to say num1 and num1. And so now it will actually print out the number and then print out the description of it. So now we will say negative 42 is negative, which it is. If we get rid of this, we will end up saying 42 is positive. So it is false, false, and it's going into this else. Now sometimes it'll be useful to not have the actual number there, but to prompt the user for an actual number. So let's go ahead and do that really quick. So let's go ahead and change this to just be an integer. Console.writeLine, please enter a whole number. Now, let's see, I don't actually want this to be on a new line for the whole number, because what it will do is it will print out please enter a whole number, put a new line, and then the line below that will ask for the actual number. So I want it to be on the same line, so we'll just do a console.write. And now if we try to read in a number, num1 is equal to console.read line. So that's going to read in a line. If we want it to just read in a value, we can do a read. Notice that reads the next character from standard input stream. The next character from the input stream, or -1 if there are currently no more characters to be read. So this will read in the next character and store it into that. So please enter a whole number. Now, oops, I did that wrong. I don't have numlock. Now, when I read in 42, it says 52 is positive. Now, why is that? Well, let's go ahead and run it again and tell it to read in 4. Notice that we get 52 again. This is comparing it against the ASCII table. So if I put in, say, A, we get 97. If I put in a capital A, we get 65. So that is the ASCII value of that next character. So read is literally going to read in the next character, a single character, and then continue on. Now this will read it into that data type, but we don't actually want it to read into that data type like that. We want to read in the entire line. We want to read in all those characters. The problem is this is reading it in as a string and it's trying to store it into an int. So what we need to do is we need to convert this over to the int type. Now you might think, oh well, let's just go ahead and cast it. Casting doesn't work for this because you can't cast a expression of type string to type int. But there is a parsing that you can do. So you can say int32 dot parse. And this parse, when I double click that, it will fill it in, converts the span representation of a number in a specified style and culture specific format to its 32-bit signed integer equivalent. So since I am using a signed integer there and I'm storing it into a signed integer, I can use the int32 parse. So now if I run this and I type in 42, notice I get 42 is positive. Also notice that these no longer say is always true or is always false, because Rider doesn't know what num1 will be, that it cannot make a determination that this will never actually execute. So let's go ahead and test this. 0, 0, 0. Not very exciting. -42. -42 is negative. What happens if I try to do in 42.5? 42.5, input string was not a correct format. So the problem is this is trying to parse the input, 42.5, and put it into a num, or an int. Unfortunately, because this has a decimal, it's not able to parse that correctly. Instead, what you would probably end up doing is parsing this into, say, a decimal and then casting it into an integer. Or you can change your storage from an int to a decimal and then do the same decimal dot parse, because this also has a parse option there. If I was to do this, I'll go ahead and do a decimal. I don't actually need the uppercase. I'm trying to use the lowercase. And 42.5. And notice that now we get 42.5 is positive. And if I was to run this again with negative 42.5, this will do negative 42.5 is negative.